Hi, everybody. My name is Bill Black, and I'm a longtime missionary in Kenya. And before that, I was in Ethiopia for many years. And presently, I'm asking these questions from the small country of Rwanda, where I'm visiting my two grandchildren who live there with their parents. Um, but Jim Harries has just published a book called How Western Anti-Racism Harms Africa and How We Can Do Better. And I thought that in order to discover more of what is in this book, I wanted to ask him some questions. So this is an international interview that's going to be taking place, and the questions coming from me in Rwanda and answers coming from him in Kenya. So, Jim, before we go any further, could you just please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be with you. My name is Jim Harries. I'm from Britain, so I was born and raised mostly in Hampshire. And my hometown, in fact, is Andover in Hampshire. As a young man, I loved agriculture, so I'd spend as much time as possible on the farm. At times, driving tractors. What I liked the most was probably working with sheep. I thought that I'd spend the rest of my life doing agriculture, so that's what I trained in. And while I was training in agriculture, God called me to say, aren't you going to use your skills in a place where people are more needy than in the UK or in Europe, where at the time we were talking about food mountains? So I believe that's how I got my call. That had me in 1988 go to Zambia to teach agriculture at a secondary school there. Um, yeah, so um, it was in Zambia that I guess that I had a lot of the shocks that I'm still recovering from today. My background was not at all in anthropology or social science. I was a scientific, agriculturally oriented person and expected that that would be sufficient to do the kind of good I wanted to do in Africa. When I got to Zambia, I found a world that I didn't think could exist. When I say that, I mean a world of cultural difference with what I'd grown up with. That to me was extraordinarily challenging. So after completing my 3 years in Zambia, came back to UK for study, and then came here to Kenya to continue ministering here. And by that point, the major thing that I was convicted over was that in order to minister helpfully to indigenous people, I should relate to them using their language and their resources. That's what we now call vulnerable mission. So instead of relating to them in English, I should relate to them in their own indigenous languages. And instead of bringing resources with me from the West, I should use indigenous resources in whatever it is I'm doing. So I've remained single, living now for 27 or 28 years in an African village. Our home language is the Luo language of Kenya. Sometimes you also use Swahili. In that home, I look after orphan children. There's a house mother who has also responsibility for them, a local lady. Now, my ministry, apart from that, I do a lot of work with local churches, essentially Bible teaching with an orientation to indigenous churches, and the Bible teaching I do is in the Luo and Swahili languages. I also work somewhat with the Coptic Orthodox Church, and that includes things like prayer for the sick, some preaching, having Bible studies with Egyptians as well as with Kenyans. And then in addition, I find myself doing a lot of scholarly work, so a lot of reading, a lot of research, and a lot of writing while I'm here.
Right. My second question is this. Tell us then, why did you write this book?
Indeed, it's a change in direction to some extent from the writing I've been doing. My writing has primarily been about how to minister to indigenous African people. what I've realized, starting many years ago, and perhaps increasingly, is that any ministry one endeavors to do in contemporary Africa is very much affected by and influenced by things happening on the global scene. And often the restrictions to what we can do, the limits to ways in which one can engage African people with the gospel, the limits to the extent to which one can function, say, in African community, are brought to us from outside of Africa. The question of anti-racism has intrigued me for a long time. The issue of racism tends to focus on black, white issues, and I'm also here constantly facing black, white issues. Now that the fact that black, white issues are largely perceived and addressed in a context in which whites are dominant, in a context in which blacks or Africans have moved onto what we might call traditional white territory, very much defines the way in which the debate about race happens. And the way that the debate about race happens in the West, particularly the US, then sets the parameters for how people understand that whites should relate to Africans in Africa. This raises then the question of, is the way that is being advocated for interracial relationship in America giving us the best platform for relating interracially within Africa, where, let's say, the whites are very much in the minority, such as in much of East Africa? Well, the answer I found is no. Insofar as the anti-racism and agenda in Western nations is dominant, many of the parameters given for Westerners to relate to Africans have a very poor fit compared to what is appropriate within Africa itself.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is, what does this book intend to do? What's your purpose in writing this book?
Essentially and very simply, my book tends to intends to encourage people to do what we call vulnerable mission that I've already mentioned. In other words, we want to encourage Western people to take Africa more seriously. How to take Africa more seriously? Two basic strategies. It's become very much the custom within Africa, where the white is very much a minority, in the same way as in the West, where whites tend to be in a majority, to, let's say, look at African people almost like a charity case. Two ways in which this consistently happens. It's very difficult, it seems to me, to find Westerners coming to Africa for anything beyond a holiday, without the objective of sharing resources, without the objective of saying, look, you are poor, our people are better off, we need to help you out with some of the resources that we have. Now, that's great in its own way, and I'm not saying that should totally discontinue, but what we are saying is, can there be a few who, instead of doing that, relate to indigenous people on the basis of their own resources? Now, there are many reasons for preferring the latter. Essentially, in order to reduce the degree to which African people relate to Westerners as donors and as potential donors. Now, the problem with this latter identity is that it determines the way in which Westerners are received and the responses they get, which in turn makes it very difficult for Westerners to get a deep grasp of what's happening in a community. I mean, if you're offering money, people want to tell you the kind of things that will result in you bringing more money. If you're offering money and you're not very wise and very careful, you bring conflict between this person and that person. Who's going to get the money? And that conflict can continue between them without your even being aware. Now, the other side to this vulnerability that we're advocating is linguistic. English and French and Portuguese are very widely used in Africa. Now, these languages, in a sense, are great. They have their values and their uses, but they also have their drawbacks. But you can see these drawbacks in many ways. Let's look at this way of looking at it or considering it. African people have their own languages and their own ways of communicating. When they learn English, they tend to impose and kind of plant English on top of their indigenous functioning. So when an African person uses English, they're using it, let's say, as a translation from their mother tongue, typically. You as an outsider, meanwhile, if you're not familiar with that mother tongue situation, you're assuming by default that they're using English in the way that you would use it back at home. How do you become familiar with that indigenous way of understanding? By using English, very, very difficult. In order to become familiar with that understanding, you really have to begin to get a grasp of the local tongue. Now, in my own experience, once you get a grasp of the local tongue and how people use their own language and the things they do with their own language, then to use English comes to appear very cumbersome indeed. So what foundationally I would like to encourage is that some Westerners, more Westerners, engage with African people using local resources and local languages.
We all know that this is a controversial issue and a controversial topic. Do you think that the people who are reading this book are going to welcome it?
I think people should read this book very carefully and very thoughtfully. I'm very aware that questions of racism are very hot in Western nations. And I've been reluctant, to some extent, in many ways, to interfere with what's such a delicate situation in Europe and America. What's prompted me to try and give some input into the situation, as I say, is my perception of the damage that it's doing to the prospects for the African continent. So will people welcome the book? I think they should. I think they should read it. I think they should endeavor to understand it and to take time to grasp what I'm saying. What am I saying with respect to the West? What I'm alerting the West about, the Western countries about, is that what you're doing in your domestic policy has implications way beyond the boundaries of your country, or even, let's say, your civilization. That Africa is in many ways a dependent position, which raises a question of the basis on which policy decisions should be made in the West. I mean, this question obviously goes a lot wider than issues of race and racism. Should Western countries be free to make policy decisions based on their own domestic context when, as is these days the case, the same decisions have a global impact? Now, one particular part, but key part, of this book concerns the gospel of Jesus. And I hope that Christians and non-Christians who are wanting to understand humankind in depth will look at this carefully. Essentially, my perception of what's happening in the Western countries under the title of anti-racism is an effort at expunging the impact of the gospel from view. This question of being colorblind comes up, I think, frequently, and is a point of much contention. Technically, many anti-racists are not in favor of colorblind anti-racism, but it's very hard to get away from colorblind anti-racism for many reasons, which says essentially treat them as if they're the same as us. Now, when that is supported by policy and academia and scholarship, differences between people of European origin and people of American origin, as against those of African origin, have to be concealed. And the things that led to those differences also have to be concealed, which is to deny people resident in Africa access to the very things that have resulted in the benefits of life in America and in Europe. So I think those things ought to be made visible. Their core thing, their main thing, is the impact of the church and of the gospel on Europe and subsequently America over hundreds and hundreds of years. It has had a profound impact. And in many ways, the impact becomes evident to me, subjectively speaking, by comparing ways of life that are going on over there in the West compared to ways of life in Africa, and say, this has changed, this has improved because of the gospel. And we also need to bear in mind when discussing this, the great love of African people for the gospel, where we have in many parts of Africa, churches all over, people devoted to the Bible, seeing the value of the gospel, seeing the immediate impact of the gospel on their lives, on their problems, something that the secular world is trying to conceal. And one of the means they're using to try to conceal it is to pretend that acknowledging the gospel is racist. I'm just not at all sure there that that is going to be of net help to Africans in Africa and even to blacks in the West.
Now, can you give us an example of something that happens in Africa that can be attributed to anti-racism in the West?
So a specific example of how anti-racism in the West affects what we do in Africa. Well, let's take the example of language. I understand that blacks in America have lost their indigenous languages. They have no choice, therefore, but to use English. An implication, as I understand in North America, that the English of Africans is somehow inferior, or even different from the English of Westerners, is seen very negatively. So there's a strong taboo on implying that people of African origin are not able to grasp English as used by Western people. That taboo in Africa then impacts us. That taboo in the West then impacts us in Africa, where people are born and raised using a language. The language connects intimately with their way of life. Education, in many respects, and much scholarship backs this position, would be much more helpful for people were to be engaged in their own languages rather than in English. Now, part of the reason that that often doesn't happen is this notion kind of empowered, fired by anti-racism in the West, that says that English is better and no African person, no black person should be denied English, which in practice can mean within Africa that indigenous languages come very much to be second class.
Now, you've obviously thought long and hard about this particular issue. From your perspective, who should read this book?
Conscientious people, concerned people, people who are called by God to serve those who are other than their own ethnicity. Secular people, atheistic people, non-believers, who I fear are missing something very important indeed. It's sad to me to hear the discussion about the gospel in the way it is often presented in the Western media that I engage with. For example, a key question often regards the supernatural. And the Western discussion of whether God exists and should we be Christian and so on revolves around, well, is there a supernatural being? That's the kind of question I'm sure that I had before I came to Africa, and that has quietly been pushed aside by my realization that for African people, Christians and otherwise, there isn't really concept of the supernatural. Now, in a sense, we can simply explain that by saying, well, there's no concept of the natural, so how come there be concept of the supernatural? If there's no understanding of this is the world, how it works kind of by clockwork, then neither can you have something other than the world of working by clockwork. From my perception from African people, it's all one. They know God has his role. That's part of our mortality. That's a breath that's in you. It's God working in you. One could go into this in different kinds of detail. The question then arises, well, who is God to African people? Now, of course, I don't have a lot of understanding of all the African people that are there. But let me just say this, that in a number of indigenous languages, the difference between the term for witchcraft and the term for God is not very clear. So the term for witchcraft is sometimes used in more contemporary times to translate the English term God. In other contexts, the term for witchcraft is left to be witchcraft, so to speak. In other words, indigenous peoples' traditional understanding of God relates to the relief that the kind of activities that come under the label of witchcraft can give them. Now, this relief comes in many ways. People protect their property through witchcraft by making it clear, by one means or another, if someone, say, steals from them, then they will succumb to some curse that's been put down for them. Witchcraft, the god of witchcraft, let's say, is rather bloodthirsty. The much African thinking considers misfortune to arise from poor relationship, and therefore good fortune to arise by resolving poor relationship, and often that poor relationship is resolved through suffering and death of somebody else. This means that the traditional notion of God in Africa tends towards certain kinds of violence. And I think that underlies African people's enormous love for scriptural revelation that tells them something different about God than their forefathers knew. And that different that they're told about God is revolutionary to ways of life here in Africa. It's ironic to me that many of the publicly visible inputs into Africa, as far as Western people are concerned, are secular. and they often analyze statistics of what's going on in order to try and provide their solutions to maybe maladies that they consider Africa to be suffering. Often then crediting perhaps availability of capital or legal system and so forth, but usually totally overlooking the massive effect on people's hearts and souls and minds that the Bible is having, just classically orienting people away from taking revenge and towards forgiveness. That's very significant indeed.
You are addressing directly the issue of anti-racism in the West. What specifically is your message to African Americans in the United States?
I think basically, God bless you. What is my message to African people? Basically the same. God bless you. I do teach the Bible a great deal here in Africa. So I think I mentioned using typically the Luo and Swahili languages as a means of helping me to perceive how God is trying to work amongst people here. That, as I say, makes me realize that there are wide cultural gaps between us Westerners and African people. So I don't claim to be, I don't intend in many ways to address African people, aside from offering them the amazing encouragement that we find in the scripture. So really this book is addressed to Western people. Now other people are welcome to read it, and I hope and I think they will be encouraged by reading it, as it throws new light onto what has become a very hot and very difficult concern for, well, millions of people. We all have our limits, and my limits certainly include my inability to have an in-depth grasp of how African people around here function. I enjoy learning what I can and applying what I can, and this book is a part of wanting to share that with others who haven't been privileged to have the same exposure to indigenous African ways of life.
And what you're dealing with in this book is complex and controversial. That being said, what changes do you hope this book will bring about?
Contemporary misunderstandings of the role of the church and of the gospel in life in the Western world, I think, are enormous. And that becomes evident in many ways. For me as a young person, and it's taken me a long time to overcome this comprehension that I was given as a young person in the UK, in the schooling system and so forth, it kind of makes no sense to devote oneself to mission in Africa. But that senselessness is not to do with truth on the ground. It's to do with the comprehension that young people in the West, myself included, were fed. And unfortunately, it seems to me, still are fed. In other words, Western education, for all its great values, has some major weaknesses. And one of those is, you could say, the necessity, in order to justify its own hegemony and preeminence, of belittling the heart of man. So thinking of, as I say, about my own youth, and if you'd have told me when I was 15 that I might now be doing what I am, I'd have been horrified, because I was so enthralled by science and what science could do for us. And that to me was the way forward, and that was the way forward I perceived when I came to Africa in 1988. I was an agriculture technologist. I wanted to help the African people grow more food because I heard they were hungry. And when I set about doing that, I found that it just wasn't so simple. Um, yeah, the church addresses the pain in the heart of mankind. The church addresses, the gospel addresses, God addresses pain in the heart of African kind. I think one of the problems with the racial issues in the West is the fact that Western people nowadays take the credit themselves for who they are. They think it's their intelligence that has achieved all the amazing things that have been achieved, and they are amazing. I mean, just look at computer technology, you know. And they quietly forget the role God had in forming our forefathers and even ourselves into being who we are. Forgetting that then makes us oblivious to the need ourselves and for others for the good news of Jesus dying for us on the cross.
Jehovah